Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I'm here with Pastor Sean Finnegan. Sean Finnegan is the lead pastor at Living Hope International Ministries in Latham, New York, near Albany. And you are, let's see here, a couple other things. You are a board member of the Unitarian Christian Alliance.
Yep, that's true.
I believe you have a master's degree from Boston College or University.
University.
The
Methodist side, not the Catholic side.
And your master's degree is in something like church history, or what is
Early
it?
Christian history.
Early Christian history. Sean is the host of the Restitutio podcast, one of my absolute favorite podcasts. He has been doing a series on the church in Corinth, or Corinth just as a historical research topic. And I've been gobbling those episodes as soon as my phone tells me that they're available. And that this is something that I wanted to talk to Sean about is, how did you get interested in this research topic? And then, what have you been learning? What does this tell us about, the context that the church in Corinth was experiencing? How does it help us understand 1st and 2nd Corinthians better, and Paul better in general, early Christianity better in general, the New Testament, and our faith at large? And so that's what I think we're going to cover for the next part of this episode. So how did you get down this path in the first place, I guess?
I'd say it was probably my experience at Boston University. I took a class with Professor James Walters. Actually, there were two classes I took with him. The first class was actually in Ephesus, in Turkey. And so it was an archaeology class, and he was the lead professor on that. And that was really my introduction. We went there for a couple of weeks and visited, I think, 8 cities in the vicinity, and certainly Ephesus as the main base in Turkey. And that was really my introduction to archaeology, to inscriptions in particular. My project was on the Library of Celsus, which, if anybody's ever been to literally even the country of Turkey, you will know the Library of Celsus. Forget about if you went to Ephesus, because Turkey itself markets a shot of the Library of Celsus on all their all their tourist stuff, and it's on the back of the screens on all the on the airplane. As you fly in, you'll see there's a shot of the Library of Celsus there. So it's a very famous ancient library. It's not in the Bible or anything, but it's probably a century afterwards. But it was what I was assigned to work on for that class, and then. It was either the next semester or the next year. I took 1 Corinthians with Professor Walters, and really got introduced to scholarship and what all the various theories were on different interpretations of things. And so that's really where I kind of got started on it. And then over time, just really considering this one question has driven me, which is how would Corinthian people, how would people in the city of Corinth, non-Christian Corinthians, how would they interpret Jesus and this whole Christian message? And then once they became Christians, and they have all that background from the Roman Empire, but they're also Christians. Now they receive this letter from Paul. How are they going to hear it? And so this is the classic hermeneutical principle of asking the question, what did the text mean to them, before asking the question, what does the text mean to us? And I think pretty much everyone would recognize that is a sound way of doing things, to figure out what the scripture meant in its original situation first. And so this led me to doing a lot of research on the city of Corinth. And as it turns out, last year I got an opportunity to go with Spirit and Truth on a tour of Greece. And I had been to just Athens in Greece and a couple of the islands, but I hadn't been to Corinth and a lot of the other biblical sites in Greece. So that was all almost a year ago now that I went to Corinth, and I got to see the ruins of the Apollo temple, which is like the most noticeable thing you see there, but also some of the other temples, and they have a nice museum there. And it's so interesting. Like, you go in the museum, and they have in the kind of like a back section, they have these statues. They have 3 statues, and there's Gaius and Lucius Caesar, and then in between them they have Augustus, the emperor, and Augustus has his head covered. He's got his toga pulled up over his head, and you know, like, I don't know, you've probably all seen statues of Roman emperors. Like, that's not normal,
Right?
And then
he looks like a Jedi or something.
Yeah, it's just weird. And then next to him, there's like just a head of Nero, and again, he's got his head covered as well. And these are not like Christian statues; these are just statues that were left over from the city. And of course, we read in 1 Corinthians about Paul's instruction to the men and to the women in 1 Corinthians 11 about head coverings, and he tells the men to stop covering their heads.
Yeah,
they should have uncovered heads. And it's like, wow, you know, this is kind of interesting. You know, what's going on here? And so there's just so many different little things like that, where studying the original culture, geography, the inscriptions that survive, even the coins, will really just bring the scripture to life. So, you know, like how they would have experienced and heard that.
Mm-hmm. So why are women supposed to cover their heads, but because of the angels? I just have to ask while we're on the subject. I have heard perhaps 10 different answers to that question, each of which seems as far-fetched as the next, and I don't know what to make of it myself. So before I let you move on to a different subject, and what is it? It's 1 Corinthians 11. Paul says that a woman should cover her hair because of the angels. And what do angels have to do with covering your hair? And why should women cover their hair in church?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just mention that women traditionally covered their heads if they were wives, if they were married. Also, there weren't that many single people just in general in the ancient world. People got married, especially women, got married young. And tragically, a lot of women died in childbirth. And a lot of men and women died from just like other things that we can treat today that they couldn't treat back then. So if you were a woman that was like late teens, early 20s or older, you were typically married. Now, they did, of course, also have widows, but typically widows would get remarried as well in their culture. In fact, Augustus actually made a rule that widows had to get married within, I think, 3 years of being widowed, because he was so eager for babies, especially among the elite. But yeah, so a woman would wear a stole over her head if she was married, and that indicated to everyone that she wasn't available. And so what the women were doing in church in Corinth, and by church I mean a house church, somebody's probably courtyard in their house, is they were uncovering. So the women were doing something radical. They were doing something bold. They were doing something weird by their own cultural standards. So Paul telling them to like not uncover themselves that's not radical. Like everyone would be like, yeah, that was making me uncomfortable too. But then he says, because of the angels, and you're like, what? What? Like, he makes a few arguments, but then like at one point he's just like, because of the angels.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and give you the theory of Dale Martin first, because it's the juiciest and most salacious of any of them, and it's the one I was exposed to in my my schooling. So Dale Martin has a chapter in his book. His book is called The Corinthian Body, and it's actually really good, really helpful in a lot of ways. I don't agree with everything in it, but there are some. He does actually help a lot. So he's a professor at Yale, now deceased. And he wrote a chapter called Prophylactic Veils. And so the idea is that the angels are going to be sexually tempted if the women have their hair out, because they're just so gorgeous. or whatever. And so, you don't want to have a repeat of what happened in Genesis 6, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive or whatever and took wives. So, like, come on, cover your head, woman. You don't want to tempt the angels, right? So that's one theory. I find that a little less convincing. I don't know. What do you think about that one?
I think that one's plausible, and it would make sense that maybe like in a church context that Paul views that as like a moment in time that is particularly sort of close to heaven, and that there's, in some sense, you're like more exposed or closer in some kind of spiritual sense to angels and the heavenly hosts and joining with them. And so out of respect for angelic lustful temptation that women, I plausible.
Okay, so I want to pick up on something you just said there. This idea that angels are in some sense like participating in or like observing the worship. I think there is this idea of sacred space that the ancients had that I think most of us who have a low church background don't have. And most high church people do have, because they get it. They have their beautiful cathedrals and their stained glass and their robes and the incense, and like they're very intentional.
Pictures of angels literally up on the top of their church or something like that.
Yeah. I got to go to Hagia Sophia in Turkey on my trip last year, and they have the seraphim painted around. They're up a little bit, but there's a balcony, and all around the balcony there's 4 paintings of seraphim, which are these 6 winged creatures. And so that was pretty standard. So I think there is an idea of sacred space, and I really kind of lean on 1 Corinthians 10 to make that point, that Paul says you shouldn't partake of the table of the Lord and of demons. And the idea being that participating in animal sacrifice in the unsacred space of worship to Apollo or some other god was considered absolutely inappropriate for Christians, because it would be taking a share in that table, would be like, in a sense, giving allegiance to demons or participating in that spiritually. So flipping that, it would make sense that angels are, in a sense, participating, or another way to say it is that we are actually linking into what they're already doing.
Yeah.
Because like in Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5, we see these like throne room scenes, and it seems like everybody's worshiping God. So when we gather as Christians to worship, we're tapping into what they're already doing. So the scholar who talks about this and who gets cited a lot is the Catholic scholar Joseph Fitzmyer in his Anchor Bible commentary. Here's what he says. He says, because of the good angels who are considered assisting at gatherings of public worship, as in Psalm 138:1. And in the Septuagint of that, it says, before angels shall I sing your praise. So the idea is that, there's some participation going on. And then he also cites Tobit, which is a Jewish extra biblical book. And then Revelation 8:3, he says, where an angel functions as a mediator of the prayers of the holy people. These angels are explained further at times as cosmic guardians of the order of the world, or even as those addressed when God said, Genesis 1:26, let us make a human being, as Philo held in Philo's book, De Obificio Mundi. And he goes on, even though he never calls them angels, but rather fellow workers. Then Fitzmyer says, the woman must have authority over her head and cover it, not only because she is in the presence of men, but because she is praying in the presence of God and his angels. And then he points out that there's all these different citations from Qumran, presumably Essene, where they talk about angels as part of their worship services as well. And so it could be, and this is, you're picking like the one thing that is like probably the least certain of anything in 1 Corinthians. But, it could be that there's a kind of like an etiquette that Paul understood, and that's kind of culturally or socially constructed, at least from where we sit now, where like the women had to wear the stole over their head, and the guy shouldn't pull up his toga over his head. So like putting things in correct order, and that violation of that, or creating a space that is in some sense hostile or shameful to the husband, like portraying yourself as single when you're really married, this would be offensive not only to the men but also to the angels. So that's kind of like a second approach, which I think is pretty good.
Yeah, and it like that passage in 1 Corinthians 5 where he's talking about the man who has relations with his father's wife,
Yeah.
when he says, when you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, or the Lord Jesus, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus. It's almost as if when all the churches are celebrating together, it's like because they're all going up to heaven or something, that Paul is in fact present remotely but spiritually at the church in Corinth, and Jesus is present as well. So this idea that you're hooking up to heaven, and if all the different churches in the different places are all hooking up to heaven, they're in some sense together.
Yeah. I like that. That's a great idea. It's kind of mystical. But hey, we're post Enlightenment now, so let's let it ride.
I mean, I don't know how else to explain what he means by that. Paul's own spirit is present in their church, even when
I don't know either.
There. Yeah. All right.
Good theory as any. So then there's one other option, is that the angels really are just messengers.
No.
And that's the position that Bruce Winter staked out. And it's the idea that high status Corinthians might be interested in what was happening, either just to make sure it wasn't a political revolution or because they had heard about their slaves going and they wanted to see if it was any good for them, or maybe they were curious for themselves. What is this new weird Christ cult? And so you wouldn't just show up. Bruce Winter and others talk about the really, really vicious series of persecutions that Tiberius, the previous emperor to Claudius, had done, and basically finding people guilty by association. So if you had attended a gathering of some sort, whether or not you were a member or you agree with them or not, that was good enough to get you executed when Tiberius was like just running through everybody and getting rid of all of his political enemies. And so that would be in living memory for these people. So they had good reason to be cautious. We know that from the time of Trajan, 50 years later or so, Pliny the Younger wrote him, the governor of Bithynia, and he asked Trajan, he said, some of these people in Bithynia here are putting together a volunteer fire department. Is that okay? And Trajan writes back, he says, absolutely not. Get rid of that fire department right away. These people are just going to use that as pretense for a rebellion of some sort. Like, you can't let people gather at all. And so that's kind of interesting too. So in light of kind of like the risk involved of attending something that you didn't really know, you hadn't vetted, it would make sense to send messengers of some sort, which the Greek word for angel and messenger is the same word, same thing in Hebrew. So it could be that high status Christian or high status non-Christians in Corinth could be sending messengers to check out the meeting. And Paul is concerned that they're going to see wives uncovering their heads, that it's like just challenging the whole status of being married. And he doesn't want them to be offended and then to report back, and then persecution could come as a result. So that's a whole nother theory on this.
Being worried about reports of immodesty or sexual impropriety or something from outsiders who are observing and watching in. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so sorry about the because of the angel sidetracked, although it's always a good. So tell us a little bit about Corinth. What was Corinth like as a place, and what made it sort of particular and unique in its time and world?
Yeah, I mean, Corinth is so fascinating, so interesting of a place. Really, it comes down to geography, where you have an isthmus, a narrow strip of land connecting Greece to the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and shipping was a big deal in the Roman Mediterranean Sea. And like, especially on either side of the isthmus, you have on the west, you have Rome, and on the east, you have Ephesus. I mean, there's a lot of other important cities too, but like, especially those two are like like to get all the way from Rome to Ephesus, you'd have to go around the peninsula, or you could go through the isthmus. And by going through, what I mean is you come into port, unload your cargo, transport it across the land, and then reload it on a different ship. And then, so that's what I mean by going through. And Corinth controlled the ports on either side of the isthmus, as well as the roadway in between the two, which is called the Diolkos. And as a result, Corinth was just like situated so well to make money on shipping. And then if you wanted to transport from the mainland of Greece to the Peloponnesian Peninsula south, then you had to pass through Corinth as well. So it's just really a strategic place. And as a result of that, it was very significant in, history before the Roman Empire, going back centuries and centuries, but especially during the Roman Empire. And there were actually several attempts to dig canals through the isthmus, but they just didn't really have the technology to do that yet, not until the 1800s.
Needed some TNT before that was really plausible. If you're sailing from Rome to Ephesus, you could save time on your journey by going through Corinth. Even though you had to go briefly overland, it would cut some time off. And I think you mentioned that the waters were safer for sailing and less dangerous than if you went across the southern tip of Greece. Like, we know what happened to Paul. Paul got blown all the way to Malta when his ship was kind of in that place. But the wind was good, but it was calmer and safer if you went sort of the Corinthian route. And then, like you said, if you're going from land from like Athens to Sparta or whatever, there's only one narrow route that you can use to get there. And so you have to go overlands through Corinth. So you've got this sea crossing and this land crossing sort of at the same place. It reminds me a little bit of Chicago. I mean, Chicago was, there's the Great Lakes, and then there's the Mississippi River system, and they get really close to each other in Chicago. Like the Des Plaines River and the Chicago River, like where I am, are less than a mile apart, even though the Des Plaines River flows to Mississippi and New Orleans, but the Chicago River flows to Lake Michigan and out to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so the Native Americans used it as a portage spot. And then the early 1800s, it became a portage spot. And then they built a canal between those two rivers. And then you could get from the Mississippi water system to the Great Lakes water system through Chicago. So Corinth had somewhat of a similar role as that.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So many of the major cities in the world are where they are for geographical reasons, and especially having to do with water. So the other thing about Corinth is that it was destroyed. And there's a whole long story of how that happened. But essentially what happened is Rome helped the Achaean League of Corinth and the other cities in the region to not be conquered by I forget who. And then, the deal was, they would still be independent, but then Rome just like decided, no, we're just going to take you guys over. And so Corinth was like a leader of the rebellion against Rome trying to take them over. And Corinth lost big time. And so a Roman general named Mummius came and he just like decimated the city, burned it. And that was like 146 BC, if I remember that correctly. And then it just lays there desolate for a century until Julius Caesar declares that he's going to have a colony built on the same site as Old Corinth. And it sort of rises from the ashes in 44 BC. Even though Caesar gets assassinated before the city really gets going, like I guess enough things were in motion that it still went ahead after his assassination, and Augustus certainly supported it as well. So Corinth and Carthage were actually both rebuilt at the same time because of Julius Caesar's decision. And as a result of that, there was there was this like myth. I could call it a myth. Maybe it's true, probably not true, but like there's this story. There are all these stories about Corinthian bronze, and Jerome Murphy O'Connor has like a whole appendix about Corinthian bronze in his book, St. Paul's Corinth, and which is a fabulous book. Everybody should buy it. But in that book, he talks about how the myth of like when Mummius was burning the city, it caused all these different like metals to combine in unusual ways that they had never done before. And out of that came this exotic Corinthian bronze. And, you know, by the time that Paul was there, like Corinthian bronze was such a big deal. It was like almost as valuable as gold. Like everyone's trying to collect it. It's big at Rome. One of the pillars in the temple at Jerusalem was made of Corinthian bronze. Like that's how big it was. And you know, Josephus's comment is like, you know, I wish there was more, but like, you know, the other ones are just gold plated, you know. So you know, it was you know, a metropolitan place of great significance. People, you know, I in my context, living 3 hours north of New York City, like New York City just dominates everything in New York State. You know what I mean? Like all of New York State could vote Republican, and if New York City votes Democrat, guess what? We're going to have a Democratic governor. You know what I mean? Like that's just, it's just, that's where there are more people in that one city than the rest of the state, or maybe half and half or something. So I get it. Like, and, you know, I'm sure people from Chicago, you know, they have like a swagger. They're like, oh, I'm from Chicago. Or, you know, New Yorkers were like this too. And Corinthians, I'm sure, had like a Corinthian pride. Like, yeah, you know, you see that statue of Hercules over there? Daedalus made that.
Yeah.
You heard of him? Yeah. You see up there on the Aqua Corinth, that's this famous temple that, you know, goes back for centuries. You know, Mummius never would even dare destroy that one. You know, and you have all this pride, this metropolitan, you know, fast paced, everybody's making money. And then they bring in basically the Olympics. They call it the Isthmian Games every 2 years. And everybody comes from everywhere. And it's held just outside of Corinth in a town called Isthmia. And it's just such a big deal. And the highest ranked office in the city of Corinth was the Agonithetes, which is the person in charge of the games, the sort of master of ceremonies of the Isthmian Games. That's the highest position above the duovirs, which are like the two consuls, if I could use the Roman term for it, was the Agonithetes. And he was just like, had to be fabulously wealthy. He had to pay for everything. And everybody came in. But if you're a merchant, if you're like Paul selling tents, or somebody else who's selling whatever, like food, goods, you would want to show up there and sell your wares, or even just stay in the city, because like people are going to come to the city as well and make purchases in the two major marketplaces. So I mean, it's just like a super happening place. I don't think many of us realize how sophisticated ancient people were, how confident they were, how like prideful they were. You know, that they had a lot going on. They had public toilets, they had running water, you know, they could get a hot bath in the main part of the city. You know, like these were people that were with it. These are not podunk people on the backwaters of the Sea of Galilee fussing with fish and you know, kind of like worried about the rain. Oh, is it going to rain? Are we going to get our crops? Like that's fine too. And like that was the context for Jesus, and that's where he ministered. But Paul's going for the city. Paul's going for the most sophisticated, urbane, high status places in the world of the Roman Empire, of the Mediterranean, and he's bringing Christianity there. And now he's got to deal with all these new issues that Jesus his people weren't worried about. So it does take a lot to like unpack, like, okay, so this is actually a new culture, a new context that's different than the Old Testament, and that's different than the Gospels.
So when Paul gets to Corinth, what's his sort of daily life like? You know, where's he staying? What's the finances of his situation? How is he evangelizing? Where is the church meeting? What are all of those things like? Like, help sort of bring that to life for us a little bit.
Yeah. This was one of the most rewarding aspects of doing the research on this. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, I mentioned his book before, St. Paul's Corinth. He's got this lovely little vignette where he kind of like speculates, like, what was it like for Paul? And he talks a lot about the business of making tents and awnings and just leather work in general. And it's like amazing, like how much definition you can get for someone's life once you know some little detail, like, all right, 1st century Corinth making tents. Like, okay, now we know that there are two main marketplaces. There's the big forum where like all the big government buildings are, and then there's the North Forum. And so it's more likely that Paul would be hooked up with Aquila and Priscilla, who were also tent makers by trade, probably in the North Forum. And their shops were like, I forget exactly the dimensions, like, I don't know, 12 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet, somewhere around that size. And, you know, we have archaeological remains of the different kinds of shops that were there, at least a few of them. And we have a fairly good sense of how things worked. Like, people would bring in things that needed to be repaired, or they would be making sales to customers who needed an awning made. Rich people needed awnings to cover parts of their courtyards of their rich houses. The theater used awnings for shade. Even the forum used awnings. Like, even the other shops would have an awning out front, so that while the person is standing there, they wouldn't be in the hot sun. And the sun does get really hot in Greece. And
that canvas is something that it lasts a while, but it wears out. And so you probably need to buy a new one or replace it every once in a while. So it generates a regular demand for that material.
Yeah. And if you're a merchant and you're going to go to Isthmia and set up a booth and sell your wares, you're probably going to want a leather tent or some sort of like what we would call like an easy up, you know, when these pop up 10 by 10s. I don't know what the ancient version of that was, but I'm sure they had some sort of thing that they could transport and they could have up, because again, the summer heat was brutal and you wouldn't just like stand outside in the sun. There's actually also a mention, I think it was Pliny the Elder, that talks about going to the beach and having like a linen tent set up, you know, while you're at the beach.
Like what do you call that? Oh, what's the word for when you're on vacation and you bring like an awning to the beach? Anyway, the comment section will remember. Yeah, not glamping, like a pergola, or I don't know, something. The word is not
it's something
quite,
people are still doing.
A cabana, like a cabana. Yeah, I think that's the word I'm looking for.
You got it.
So Paul is working with Aquila and Priscilla. They make leather. It's a rather labor-intensive process where you're taking leather and you're sort of, you know, cleaning it and putting wax on it to waterproof it. And so, you know, you're with your hands and your tools doing a little bit of sewing and a little bit of waxing and stuff like that. And then you're manning your shop, presumably during the day, to sell to customers and stuff like that. So, like, when is Paul evangelizing? What does he have any free time? Like, what's that sort of looking like, do you think?
Yeah. Well, let me read you this little quote by Murphy O'Connor, because it really is lovely. He says, in the back of the shop, a series of stone or brick steps was continued by a wooden ladder to a loft lit by an unglazed window centered above the shop entrance. This is where the family that owned the business slept, cooked, and ate. A hired man, such as Paul, would have slept in the workroom. Each worker had a bench on which tools were laid out, such as straight and curved needles, an awl, a punch, pincers, half-moon knives, shears, and an edge shaver. They worked seated in leather aprons stained by the wax they used both to roll the flax thread and to protect the hides. I just love that little description. It's like really kind of helps you to imagine, you know, here he is hunched over his work and working just hour after hour with a needle and thread, or the ancient equivalent of thread. And he's probably got a lot of spare brain power to think, to talk, to listen, right? And so I kind of make a case in my Corinthians class that this is actually an optimal evangelism situation for Paul. I think a lot of us think Paul, being so extroverted, having such an exotic and magnificent testimony, would just like accost people randomly on the side of the street and be like, "Let me tell you about Jesus." I'm a little less inclined to think that that's how he was doing it. So you've got shops on either side of you. First of all, they're within earshot. You can have a conversation. A lot of these shops actually even had a window between shops where you could talk to the people on the other side. He would be having to go get food. He would probably need to take breaks occasionally throughout the day. And you're in a courtyard area, which they call a forum, the North Forum. There's 44 shops in there. And so there's all kinds of people milling about. He might have to go over and buy some food, or maybe buy some supplies. Maybe he has to go buy some flax thread from somebody else and then bring it back. And so every one of these interactions presents an opportunity for evangelism. And, so we know Paul was a very driven and charismatic person who was not afraid to tell his testimony. In the book of Acts, like we get his testimony over and over, and like at the most difficult times, like he's being hauled in to the Roman fortress there, and there's a mob trying to lynch him. He's like, "Yo, do you be all right if I just share my testimony real quick?" And he does. He lays into it, and then they erupt in protest, and he has to be brought in. And then like multiple times after that, also he shares his testimony with different Roman officials. So we know that he was like that kind of a guy that would share his testimony. So you could just imagine people coming in for work, and they're like, "Oh, hey, are you new to the area?" And Paul is such an enigmatic person because he's got like incredible language skills. Like his Greek is really good. I mean, it's not like snobby upper class Greek, but like it's better than it should be for a peasant. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. And he can read, which is really weird. And he can presumably write, or usually he used a scribe and amanuensis to do the writing, I think. But he's traveled. He's from the exotic East. I think just people would be interested in him. And he'd say, "Oh, it's about this guy. I want to tell you about this guy, Jesus." Well, it wasn't a cliche. No. Like you say that to somebody, it's like, "Yeah, whatever, get out of my face." It was brand new. It was fresh. So I think a well-educated, well-traveled, well-spoken person who was like one of them, because he's working there, he's living there, he's poor, they're poor. I think he was just like a powerhouse evangelist, and people would probably start coming to the shop for little meetings. That's probably, we can't say for sure, but that's probably how the church really got started, until he converted some wealthier person who owned a house. At that point, we can move to somebody's house. And all you really need to do is convert one wealthy person. That wealthy person is going to have friends that are also wealthy. And if they're a real Christian, they're probably going to want to invite their friends to hear about this Jesus. So things can really take off from there. But I think for a while, he's just dealing with that. And then on Saturday, he goes to the synagogue. He goes to his own people, the Jewish people, and he's preaching there. And he causes all kinds.
Was there a synagogue in Corinth? What was the Jewish situation like in Corinth? Like Priscilla and Aquila had fled there because they got expelled from Rome. I also was reading dialogue with Trypho recently, and Trypho the Jew leaves Judea after the Romans, expelled the Jews from the homeland in Judea, and he goes to Corinth. So, there are Jews in Corinth, but was it a large Jewish population, small? Was there a big synagogue? Not really. What's that situation like?
Honestly, it's hard to say. We don't have archaeological remains, other than we do have like one inscription, and it's like on display in the courtyard of the museum in Corinth, where it says, I'm trying to remember, Synagogue of the Hebrews or something like that. So there's like a partial inscription, but like that's it. Like we don't have the archaeological remains of synagogues in Corinth, at least not that I'm aware of. So we're basically dependent on the text. Now the text, especially in Acts chapter 18, talks about multiple synagogue benefactors, or usually translated officials. including Sosthenes and I think it was Crispus is the other one. But there's a couple mentioned in Acts chapter 18. So like we know there was a synagogue. We know they were meeting there. We know that Paul got kicked out and he ended up going to the neighboring house, which I think was Titius Justus, was a neighboring house and setting up shop there for having meetings with people for a little bit. We know that later on, this is from the end of Romans, a man named Gaius must have been very wealthy because the whole church could meet in his home. And the church, by this time would have been, dozens of people. So, we know a little bit, but we just don't know as much as we would like to know about the Jewish situation. We know for sure there were Jews in Corinth, no question there. But the size of it, was it like a really fancy synagogue, like the one we see in Sardis, which is fabulous, by the way, if you ever go to there.
My dad was there recently. I've not been there. Yeah.
Yeah. Or it could have been a smaller one.
So I want to peek ahead a little bit. I know you haven't gotten here in your series, which is part of the reason why I'm curious. What's going on with the speaking in tongues stuff and the spiritual gifts? Like, I know that you and I grew up with probably a similar perspective on those passages. I know that Will Barlow has been really digging into that, and I've been learning a lot from him on that. So, like, what has your investigation into Corinth helped you see or realize or think about, especially like Corinthians 12, a little bit 13, and then 14 again, dealing with prophecy, speaking in tongues, spiritual gifts, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So this is something I go into detail on in this class, extensive detail on. So I'm going to be very brief in comparison here. As far as looking for parallels to speaking in tongues, in all honesty, there are none. Like nobody spoke in tongues in the ancient world. The closest we can find, and I don't know if you ever heard of this before, but the closest we can find is magic tablets, where you have like little spells with just like randomly spelled out syllables of words that the scholars say are not a language or not a known language, at least. So that's really the only parallel I could find to any kind of speaking in tongues. And I think those are actually later, or mostly later than the first century. So I don't think there's any possibility of a connection there.
Did the oracle at Delphi have like an oracle who would make strange noises and then someone interpret the noises for the people seeking, information from the gods or something like that?
Yeah. Let me give you a little quote on that, because I would say, let me give you a short answer. Yes, for prophecy, no for speaking in tongues. So when it comes to the Oracle of Delphi, or there are other famous oracles as well, also there are what they call the Sibyls, which are, usually women who, like the oracles, were prophesying. These sorts of things, they're well attested, they're well respected, and it makes perfect sense that people in Corinth would be like, yo, I want to be like that. This is a high status behavior. I'd like to copy it. I'd like to have access to that. And I'm sure they thought of speaking in tongues as like along the same lines of speaking. The term I use for it is divine speech, speaking in the language of the gods, that sort of thing. The Oracle of Delphi is really, really well documented, although it lasts for so many centuries that it does, like, you have some conflicting reports. But really the guy that's super helpful on the Oracle of Delphi is Plutarch. And he's got a couple of really good books on the subject. And he describes kind of a sophisticated view of inspiration that I actually thought was like really relevant and helpful for like Christians today, which I was not expecting to find there. But like basically he says like, hey, you really just need to kind of open yourself. You gotta make sure that you're not stressed out, and all these like really practical tips for like hearing from God. Of course, if you're in an Apollo temple, you're hearing from a different God than the God of Jesus, right? The Father. So, you're in a different, I would argue, as a demonic context. But like when they talk about the descriptions of the Oracle of Delphi speaking, is just creepy and crazy. Like the God will sort of like mount the woman, and she'll run around the room, and she'll be shrieking, and it won't be like articulate speech. It'll just be like groans and all this weirdness. And then like as he masters her, she kind of like calms down, and she still like raves with her lips for a little while. So that's like the closest part to like the speaking in tongues phenomenon, but I don't think it's really comparable, because it's not actually syllables. It's just more like shrieks and weird sounds as somebody's like getting possessed by Apollo is in the Oracle of Delphi. And then finally the Oracle will actually speak, and will be speaking on behalf of the God. Now it is true, and I think you were leaning on this idea that a lot of times the Oracle would speak in such a way that it was like a little bit poetic or complicated, and that there were professional priests that would then write down the answers in a way that people could understand. Or even I've heard the opposite too, where the oracle will respond in just like regular language, and then the priest will turn it into verse and then give it to the person that was asking for it. So all I got to say, Sam, is you just got to wait, and I'm going to deliver on this, because there are also a couple of other weird things. I got into all of it, man. There's another one called, there's a goddess named Cybele with a C, and she's the mother goddess. And she has some male worshipers that like get themselves into a frenzy, and there's some weird stuff that happens there. Some like inspired, ecstatic speech. I wouldn't say speaking in tongues necessarily, but definitely some like ecstatic frenzy. That's kind of like another phrase they use a lot in the ancient sources. And then there's also Bacchic rituals where Bacchus is the same as Dionysus, so it's the god of partying and wine. And so that is a god that they will usually have women worshiping, like outside the village. They'll go out to the woods, and they'll have some sort of like weird dancing and ecstatic, speech of some sort. And so there are all these different things that are like commonly known to be available for special people. Like to be part of a Bacchic cult or Dionysian cult it's a mystery cult. So like you have to be initiated. You have to like know the right people. Cybele is kind of like not as popular in cities anyhow, and I think it's more of like an Eastern thing. But maybe there were some people, but these are very exclusive kind of cults. And then, to be an oracle, forget about it. You have to be born into it. You have to be in the right place, right? So the idea of being able to participate in divine speech, whether it's speaking in tongues, prophecy, whether it's a word of wisdom, whether it's a discernment of spirits, whether it's a word of knowledge, any level of divine speech that we want to talk about, everyone would want to do it. It's like the exact opposite as the way people think of Pentecostals today. People think of Pentecostals as wackos, country bumpkins. They're uneducated. They have this like terrible snobbish attitude towards any kind of divine speech that Christians participate in, right? In the ancient world, exact opposite. They're like, this is high status. I want to do it. If I do it, I'll be cool. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that this was actually something that Corinthian Christians were using to assert their dominance, to assert their prestige in the gathering on a Sunday, where they would be like, hey, I'm now going to give you a word from God. or from I'm going to speak the language of angels. There's a whole lot on that too. Like in 1 Corinthians 13, it says, though I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, right? So is that rhetorical, or did Paul really think there were such a thing as speaking the language of the angels? And in researching that, I came across two Jewish documents, Testament of Job and the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, pseudepigraphical books that talk about speaking in the language of angels. So, this is something that like other Jewish communities also.
Interesting. I had never been aware of any Jewish precedent for speaking in tongues.
Yeah, there's two. And then the other one is, so I don't remember who the author was, but somebody was talking about Homer, and in Homer, there's a place where he says, well, the gods call this river this name, but we call it this name, but the gods call it. So the idea is that like the gods do actually have a different language than we speak, and Homer knows it. And so this is like later tradition. It's like, yeah, Homer knew the divine language. So like there was kind of a sense that like this was a possibility. I can't say for sure if Paul is using that just rhetorically or legitimately. I will say this, that Dale Martin is 100% in on the language of angels being what they thought they were doing, which is not a position you hear too much today. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But the big takeaway is that what Paul does with divine speech is he does three things. In chapter 12, he uses the body analogy, and which was totally revolutionary, totally radical. He says the parts of the body that have honor don't need any more honor. The parts of the body that don't have honor, let's honor them. That is an unthinkable thing to say in that world. You don't honor slaves and freedmen if you're an elite freeborn Christian. Like that's just what they honor the elite. The elite don't honor them. So he just flips the whole thing. And then 1 Corinthians 13, you've got the love chapter. He says, even if you speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but you don't have love, you're nothing. That's totally radical. That's totally fresh. There's literally nothing even close to that in all of the at least the ones I could find. And I found dozens of all the different instances of divine speech in the Greco-Roman world. Nobody talks about love. Nobody talks about caring about how it affects other people. It's all just like focused on the phenomenon itself. And if anything, it's the opposite. It's like, I don't care what you think. No. This is my oracle, and you better, even if it's a doom oracle, you're just like, it's your problem, And then in chapter 14, that phrase he uses over and over, build up, build up, build up. So 12, 13, and 14 is all about divine speech in the church. And what he says is we need to honor those who are less honored, love, and then build up. These are all exciting, radical, out of the box ideas, or outside the area. Like nobody, even in Judaism, nobody talks like this. It's just like fresh. To me, it's like inspiration. Like these are evidence of Paul actually being inspired to write, because they're just so weird. Yeah. And of course, like as Christians, we're like, yeah, I know the body, and if the hand says to the foot, you're not of the body. For us, it's a cliche. Forget about the love poem. We see it at every wedding. We're like, love is patient, love is kind. Like for us, it's all old hat. But like for them, this was the emergence of a brand new, exciting, revolutionary idea that would have been received as controversial in Corinth in the first century.
So you're saying that there are kind of some precedents for divine speech out there, but it doesn't seem super analogous to what's being described in 1 Corinthians. And maybe there's even some Jewish mentions of the language of angels and things along those lines. But that there is this charismatic activity going on in the church in Corinth, and Paul is mostly interacting with it to make sure that they're doing it in the right way for the right reasons and ways that build up people and honor people and are inclusive of everyone and more equalizing of status as opposed to distinguishing of status and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when it comes to divine speech, there's actually a lot of interest in it in the ancient world, which is really great for researching the subject. But what I was saying is the phenomenon specifically of speaking in tongues, they just don't have really any clear parallels other than like the magic spells. But I think those are a little later and not really a good comparable. So, and, here's the other thing too, Sam, and you really picked this up in chapter 14, is that Paul does not look at prophecy or speaking in tongues or interpretation. He doesn't look at those three in particular as ecstatic. And what I mean by ecstatic is where you're kind of like displaced from your normal mental state.
Sure.
Like other things, maybe you could argue are ecstatic, like dreams or visions or something like that. But he expects a person in the congregation prophesying to be aware enough of his or her surroundings that he or she could see that somebody else wants to prophesy. Because he says, if a revelation comes to somebody else who's seated and you are prophesying, you should stop and let that person go. And then he says, the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. So the idea is not a wild frenzy where you're just out of your mind. And that's mostly what the Greco-Roman parallels are talking about, like going all the way back to Plato. Plato talks about this a lot too,
where the spirit has control over the person, and Paul is saying that that's not how it is. Interesting. So let's see here. What does it make you think about communion? Because that this has been a topic that I've been sort of thinking and wrestling about, and the longest, clearest passage about communion or the Eucharist or whatever your preferred term is in 1 Corinthians. So what's going on with that? How do you feel like your investigation into Corinth has helped you think about and look at that passage?
I don't really get into the theology of communion much, or really the theology of anything much, because I'm just mostly interested in background information and how that illuminates the reading of the text. I do kind of break my own rule on that when it comes to 1 Corinthians 8:6, because it was right there. And there's just so much shenanigans with that text that I just felt like I really need to just go full bore on 1 Corinthians 8:6. So that that one lecture is actually different than all the other ones. But I would say for 1 Corinthians 11, the big takeaway for me is about status and consideration of essentially poor people or low status people. The estimates are that we have maybe something like 50 to 60 people in the church at this time. That's just I think I labeled or I counted out 28 individuals, which is crazy that between 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Acts, you could identify 28 named individuals. 13 individuals, but if we assume that they had spouses, it would be 28.
Gotcha.
So anyhow, my estimates based on Jerome Murphy O'Connor's work is something like 50 to 60 people in the church. And so not everyone would necessarily meet every Sunday, and we do think it was Sunday because 1 Corinthians 16 says, set the offering aside on the first day of the week. So that's why I'm saying Sunday. But here's the deal. In an ancient Roman villa, you have the triclinium, which is the dining room, and you have 3 couches in there. That's where the word, the prefix tri comes from. And so all your high status people are going to go in there. Maybe 9 to 12 people would be able to fit in there comfortably. And then out in the atrium, and we know what their houses are like from archaeology. That's not a question. We've got we have 3 houses, either 3 or 4 in Corinth that have been excavated, but then comparables in Pompeii and Ephesus. This is something we know very well about. Okay. So you have your dining room, and then you have the atrium, which is a room that would have maybe space for 20 to 40 people, something like that. And so most of your people would be in there, depending on how big the house was. And so here's the custom in the Greco-Roman world, is that you should rank your friends based on what assigned seats. You know what I mean? So your highest status people would sit closest to the host, and then going out from there. And then you should feed them different foods and give them different wines based on their relative status. Which is just, this is really funny. But like, we have a number of sources complaining about this, saying, well, Juvenal is the most hysterical. Juvenal writes like 50, 60 years later in Rome, and he talks about like how, this guy's walking by with this tray with a big old lobster on it to like the front of the table, and you get this like little crappy shrimp, like it's not even fully cleaned, and so this was this is standard culture, standard etiquette. And here's the thing. You have these different families gathering together for a worship service involving a communion or Eucharist. Who has a higher status? How do you seat these people? And so most of your folks would be out in the atrium just eating like whatever is available, whether they brought their own or is provided by the host. It doesn't specify. But then at that table, there's like some fierce jockeying for position. And these people don't have the teachings of Jesus, like that's what they're learning. They didn't grow up with this story that Jesus tells about like, take the lowest spot and then let them say to you, come up higher, right? They don't have that. So they're just being worldly people. And so the innovation that I see and the really exciting thing in 1 Corinthians 11 with Paul is him saying that Jesus is the host. He calls it the Lord's Supper. It's not Gaius' supper. That would be standard. You would say it's the host, it's his supper, it's his dinner, he's the one that's hosting it. Paul says, no, it's Jesus's, and you're offending Jesus by treating these other people badly. You're going ahead and getting drunk. These people are going hungry. You are, he says some very, very shocking things, but like you're basically offending Christ because he's the host of the meal. So I thought that was kind of like a really exciting way of perceiving the whole communion situation. I didn't really get too much into the theology on this one.
No, I think it's almost impossible for us to imagine sometimes how hierarchical their culture was, and how that was just embedded in almost every social interaction, every meal, all aspects of society, language, how you address people, that sort of thing. Because us Americans just have a hard time recognizing that. And maybe some of us have been to some cultures that are a little bit more that way, but I don't think I've ever been to any culture that's as hierarchical and just upfront and obvious and unashamed of their hierarchicalness as it seems like that Greco-Roman culture was at that time.
Yeah. I mean, the Romans were all about power, and the people in Corinth, they literally idolized, made idols out of the Roman emperors and their families. So, you look at the behavior of the Roman emperors and their relatives, it's like this sort of like celebrity bad behavior you might find at the checkout aisle in the grocery store magazines section, where like this horrible thing happened, the gossip, like those are the ones that they're idolizing, that they're looking up to. And it's all about status. It's all about like who can get ahead and how can you improve your situation and your family's situation. Plus, throughout Corinth, we have all these inscriptions that have survived. And these inscriptions are crazy because they just put so many names on them. Makes them like just terrible to read, because like who wants to read names? But like they'll put every family member they can think of on there and every accomplishment they've ever had, because like that is how you lift up your status in the eyes of the public. Be like, hey, that's my grandfather's statue there. It's a statue. You see that inscription there? And then they would preserve that name generation after generation so that, it was clear that the honor continued.
Yeah.
It's just like a major obvious thing for them that for us as Americans, we're just like, dude, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
But why are we like that? We are like that because of the influence of Christianity on the world.
Yes.
So this has to start somewhere.
Yeah. All right. So I think I'll ask my last question of you. What are some of the things that in your own personal life you feel like through this exercise of digging into Corinthians and Corinth have really sort of popped out and stuck with you and that you're carrying around?
Yeah. There's too many for me to mention. I actually learned an immense amount during this class. Like I had good instincts about like where to look for things. And I had a couple of like really great secondary sources. Bruce Winter's book, After Paul Left Corinth, fantastic. The Jerome Murphy O'Connor book, and the Dale Martin book, The Corinthian Body. Those three in particular were really helpful at like pointing me in the direction of like what ancient sources should I be looking. But then I would go to the ancient source and then I would read around it and discover my own stuff too, in addition. And, I, like I said, had intuitions and instincts about things, but like actually seeing it was like, oh my goodness, this is so exciting to see how Christianity is this revolutionary new way of thinking, worldview, if I could put it that way, that came into the world. And yeah, I mean, there was a lot of precedent with Judaism, certainly like the sexual ethics is there. But there's a lot of newness with Christianity that's bringing in because of the cross. And how Paul talks about Christ crucified. Like that is a totally weird thing based on Greco-Roman sensibilities or Judaism. You don't talk about your rabbi who got crucified as a hero and brought salvation. That is a fresh entrance into the world. And so there have been, I'll just mention one because it's on the top of my head, lawsuits. I was under the impression that what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6 is that Christians should never sue Christians. And so, like, if a Christian had done something bad to another Christian, they should just never take that person to court, no matter what it was. You should always just try to work it out. And basically thinking even of like a lot of the controversies that the Roman Catholic Church had with some of the priests that were molesting children. It's like, okay, well, it's the church probably reading 1 Corinthians 6 is saying, oh, well, you can't work this out among yourselves. Like, is there one wise person? And so I just kind of always had thought that was like a universal, but doing the research, I was like, oh no, they divided between criminal cases and civil cases. And this is talking about ordinary or trivial matters. That's what Paul's addressing here. He's not talking about rape. He's not talking about child molesting. He's not talking about murder. He's not talking about capital crimes or public crimes. He's just talking about like, business deals or slander or these kind of like lower level things. And it was like, wow, that really does change my mind on it and seeing it over against its own background rather than just like universalizing it. So I thought that was really, really helpful. And I actually have a friend who did sue somebody. And it was because of medical malpractice. And that person identifies as a Christian, but he still sued him anyhow because it was the only way to get this person to stop doing the thing that was hurting people.
Yeah.
And some people I'm sure were like, hey, why you're a Christian? What are you suing for? But I think actually there is a righteous suing.
Yeah. And it's not that you shouldn't sue. It's that you should settle your disagreements inside the church, and that you should be able to find a good judge or a good, mediator inside the church. And not that your dispute should never be resolved or you should just forgive everything, but you should be the church should be able to handle that level of disagreement. And it could be that, the leader of the church says, hey, this guy gives me good reason to think that you owe him $300, so pay up, right? Like it's not just
what church even does this, Sam?
Right. I don't know. None that I know of, Sean.
Well, since I mentioned something negative about the Roman Catholics, let me mention something positive. They do it, and they've been doing it for centuries. Maybe they're doing it in more cases than they should, but they do have this set up. Whereas like us Protestants, we're like, well, if I don't like what the pastor or the elders are telling me to do, I'll just leave and go to another church. Right. So, it's a lot to think about there, but, I think we could do this. And I think it would be good for our witness rather than airing our grievances out in public, at least for these, what he calls trivial matters. Like, let's just settle this stuff and figure it out among ourselves. I think that would be a really, really great takeaway.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any last words you want to share?
Well, I just want to invite anybody watching or listening to this to check out the class. You can do that at restitutio.org, which is my podcast. We have the audio version there. Or if you want to cheat and look ahead, the video version is already fully out. So you can find that on Living Hope International Ministries YouTube channel. So if you just type in LHIM on YouTube, you should be able to find it there. But yeah, it's called 1 Corinthians in Context. And I hope people can enjoy the process. Really, it's a methodology on modeling where over and over we ask the question, okay, what would they have thought about this? And then figuring that out and then coming to the text and then reading the text over against its original context. And it's just like pop, 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 pop. Like stuff is just coming to life so well throughout the process. It's been a really exciting journey. And thanks so much for having me on, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my main lesson and takeaway is that we forget at how unique and different Christianity was in its original context. And really digging into the original context helps Christianity pop out as in terms of its distinctives. Why is Paul even bothering about this subject, right? Like those sorts of questions. And it's like, and it really helps you to do that sort of imagine it from the outside and be able to reappreciate it from the inside. But I also feel like our society is de-Christianizing and that we will need to have a stronger sense of distinctiveness than we've had in a long time. I'm not saying that our society is going to look exactly like, late classical Corinth, but in some ways it might, but in many ways it won't be. And that this transition back to something of the church being really distinctive and needing to be able to define itself and stand up for itself and communicate those distinctives to its members is, I think, something that'll be increasingly important.
Yeah, absolutely. We had somebody come to the church for the first time 2 Sundays ago. He's fairly young, 19 years old. He had never been to a church before in his entire life. And his question was, where do I sign up? You know what I mean? Because to go to an event, usually you would register or you would go to like Ticketmaster or, he's like, so where do I go to sign up to come? Which I think is like kind of an interesting take on the whole thing. It's like some people have no idea what a church even is. Even by today's standards is so weird because like we're really not there to entertain. And we are a real robust community where like when your relative dies and you're in my church and I don't even know your relative, I go to the funeral. I don't go to the funeral for your relative. I didn't even know that person. I go for you because when one member of the body hurts, we all hurt together. You know what I mean? And like, this is just like a radical, weird thing. Nobody's getting paid, some of us are on staff, but like generally speaking, by and large, people that are doing stuff are volunteer within the church, which is another thing that's just like, why are you showing up early? We have people that come at 8:00 on a Sunday morning for band practice every week, 8:30, sometimes even earlier, and they're not paid. You know what I mean? Like this is because of something higher, and it is really cool, I think, to be a testimony to the world in which we live today, that this is just like a different way of living. It's based on love. It's not based on transactional reciprocity. It's based on like, I have received, so now I'm giving, regardless of even if you respond favorably. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. All right. Well, John, thanks for coming on Transfigured. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.